Ladies and gentlemen, I've been playing with Xbox Series X for 4 to 5 days now, and I'm here to report back everything you need to know about loading times, quick resume, performance, console design, and the controller, which are the topics that I'm allowed to talk about right now. Every game that I tested was from Game Pass. I downloaded games from the subscription service there, except for Resident Evil 7, which is on Game Pass, but I did have the physical disc version for the Xbox One that is compatible with the Series X. So for Resident Evil 7 specifically, I used the physical disc just in case it would cause any conflicts with some of Series X's features. So let's just dive right in, starting with loading times. Keep in mind that none of these games have been optimized for Series X. Most tests basically involve me loading up a save file, and as soon as I hit the confirm button, that's when I'd start timing, and the results are certainly striking. There is just a huge difference between what the One X could do with the HDD and what the Series X can do with the SSD. And I've jotted down my notes right here in my Surface Duo, which I know has the Microsoft logo, but bears no relation to this preview. This is my smartphone that I bought with my own money, FYI. So, with all that out of the way, let's go right ahead and dive into loading times, starting with Resident Evil 7, which yielded really impressive results. So loading up a save file on the One X took 1 minute and 3 seconds. Loading up the same save file on the Series X, save file downloaded from the cloud, took only 12 seconds, a huge markdown, and I have the footage to prove it. I'm not going to do this for every game, but for Resident Evil 7, I went further along into the game, and this is a separate save file that I loaded up again with similar results to the ones that I just relayed. So check out footage showing just how much faster Series X loads Resident Evil 7 save file. Yep, it's pretty insane, and I know if you're a PC gamer, you already know what it's like to have a game installed on the SSD and have that load up so much faster, but it's just really nice to finally see SSDs become standard on consoles and get the same kind of fidelity of loading times as PC on consoles, given how many people play games on consoles or how many games are exclusive to consoles. This is just, a win all around. Next, I loaded up Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice on the One X. The save file that I had loaded up in 37 seconds, whereas on the Series X, that was reduced significantly to only 8 seconds. Now, interestingly enough, for some reason, after a system update on my Series X that arrived in the middle of this preview period, Hellblade no longer was compatible with the Series X. I couldn't boot the game up anymore, but I did test those loading times before compatibility for Series X was removed, and I'll address backwards compatibility later in the video. Next up, we have Bloodstained. That is not a graphically intensive game, so it loads up pretty quickly on the One X at 14 seconds, but it loads much faster on the Series X at only 3.5 seconds. Darksiders 3 on the One X loaded up a save file at 21 seconds. On the Series X, it only loaded in 8 seconds. Doom Eternal, I started a new game 20 seconds to start a new game. On the Series X, it only took 5 seconds. Monster Hunter World, loading up a save file, took 59 seconds, about a minute. On the Series X, it only took a sixth of that, only 10 seconds. Nier Automata, starting a new game, took 11 seconds. On the One X, on the Series X, it only took 6 seconds. Batman Arkham Knight, One X, loading a save file, 31 seconds. On the Series X, it only took 13 seconds. For Tekken 7, this was a special case where there were multiple loading times. So there's a loading time from when you boot the game all the way to the Bandai Namco logo. So I timed that on the One X, 31 seconds, on the Series X, 16 seconds. Then from the start screen, when you hit start all the way to the main menu, there is a second loading time there. 10 seconds on the One X, 6 seconds on the Series X, and finally, I got into a match. I went into practice, and I picked the same characters, Hwoarang versus Jin, and went to the same stage, Mishima Dojo. And on the One X, it took 30 seconds to load. On the Series X, 20 seconds to load. So still an improvement, though not as drastic of an improvement as some of the other games that I've tested out. Next, Dishonored 2. On the One X, it took 18 seconds to load a save file. On the Series X, it took 7 seconds. Final Fantasy 15, starting a new game, took 43 seconds on the One X. It only took 16 seconds on the Series X. Sea of Thieves, I did multiple tests. So from boot all the way to the start menu, I got a minute and 2 seconds on the One X and 20 seconds on the Series X. And then setting sail, so as soon as I pressed the button, I started timing. On the One X, a minute and 20 seconds to finally get in-game. On the Series X, it was only 30 seconds. 3 more games to go. Yakuza 0, One X, only 14 seconds to load. On the Series X, it was half that at 7 seconds. And for the final 2 games, I tested out Xbox 360 games from Game Pass. So Fallout New Vegas, 16 seconds to load a save file on the One X, and on the Series X, it only took 6 seconds. And finally, Mass Effect loaded very quickly on One X at 6 seconds, but on Series X, it was lightning quick, only 2 seconds. And then there were 2 more games I wanted to test out, Witcher 3 and Gears 5, but those 2 games were not compatible with Series X, though that will be addressed once the console launches, when more games will be compatible. Again, I'll talk about backwards compatibility in a bit, but in terms of loading times, test results, that's everything you need to know from the games that I've tested. And if you go to other outlets' impressions, you'll find games that they've tested that may be different from mine. Across the board, a major improvement. And again, I'll emphasize, none of these games have been optimized for the Series X. It just runs that way because of the improved hardware and because Xbox did a really good job with backwards compatibility. And when you really consider just how many loading times you see in a video game, not just loading a save file, but also, going from one world to another, walking through doors, whatever it is, when you consider how much faster the Series X loads, you kind of begin to realize how much time you're really saving with each of these loading screens that could last from 30 seconds to a minute that are now being reduced to, 10, 5 seconds. It's pretty crazy, and it just feels really good to be constantly immersed in game with loading screens that feel more negligible. And what will save you even more time is Quick Resume, which is a feature that allows you to exit out of a game, play another game, and then go back to the game you were playing that you paused and resume from exactly where you left off without having to boot the game up all over again, load up a save file. You're just in there from the moment you resume that game. It's a very nice feature. It takes about 5 to 10 seconds to cycle from one game to the next, but it does work. You start exactly where you had previously left off. Now, one question that I wanted to answer was how many games can be quick resumed at a time? How many games can you have running at a time before, games are forced to quit? So the way I tested that was that after I downloaded an entire library of games from Game Pass, I loaded every single one of those games in alphabetical order. So you've got Batman Arkham Knight, Bloodstained, Darksiders 3, Dishonored 2, Doom Eternal, Fallout New Vegas, Final Fantasy 15, Mass Effect, Monster Hunter World, Nier Automata, Resident Evil 7, Sea of Thieves, Tekken 7, and finally Yakuza 0. There were 2 games that I did not boot up, Final Fantasy 15 Comrades, I just felt it was redundant, and Hellblade because, as I previously noted, it was just no longer compatible. By the time I started testing Quick Resume, compatibility had been removed for that game, though I assume it is coming back eventually. And again, I'll talk about backwards compatibility in a bit. But as far as Quick Resume goes, I loaded up all of those games in alphabetical order, and then I went in reverse alphabetical order to see how far back I could go before a game would restart completely. So at this point, Yakuza 0 was the active game. I exited out of that, went to Tekken 7, loaded up just fine. Now, when I went to Sea of Thieves, interestingly, the game didn't have any sort of quick resume feature by default, and I think it's because this is an online game, and online functionalities do shut down when you pause a game before quick resuming them, so there'd be no point in implementing quick resume in a game like Sea of Thieves. That's why I figure it doesn't have a quick resume feature, so I'm not going to count that game. And then after that, it was Resident Evil 7, and I kept going all the way until I got to New Vegas. That game quick resumed, and then Doom Eternal finally was when I had to restart the game from scratch. So not counting Sea of Thieves, as I kept going back, I found that I could have 8 games that I could cycle through with quick resume. The 9th game and beyond, so Doom Eternal, Dishonored 2, Darksiders 3, Bloodstained, and Batman Arkham Knight, none of them could be quick resumed. So there is definitely a limit, though what the limit is varies from news outlet to news outlet. So I got up to 8 games before quick resume stopped working for older games, and then some outlets got up to 12, others only maxed out at 5, and then sometimes I would max out at 6 or 7 games that could be quick resumed instead of 8. So it really does vary, but I think the magic number that Xbox has said will guarantee work is 5 games running at a time that you can cycle through and quick resume between. And I generally found that to be true. When I did cycle through 5 games, that never failed, but beyond that, results could be inconsistent here and there. But honestly, 5 games is fine. I'm never playing more than 5 games at a time, so being able to cycle between games that I play frequently and just pick up right where I left off, it's a legitimately awesome feature, and you add that on top of fast loading times and you really realize how much time you're saving because you no longer have to boot the game up and go to the start menu, load a save file, like all that whole process can take a minute or two, and so to be able to forego that entirely and only have to wait 5 to 10 seconds instead, it just makes the experience of diving back into a game just so much more immediate. Everything just felt so much swifter with Series X. And this is one feature that I've not been able to replicate on PC. On PC, you do have to shut games down. You can't have them minimize and run other games if you don't want to compromise performance. And if there is a way to replicate quick resume on PC, I don't know about it. But on Series X, it works really well, and having played with the console for days, I found it to be a very convenient feature. Another question that I asked for myself was, does quick resume work if I completely power off the console, if there's a power outage, or if I unplug it? And I discovered that for the most part, yes, any game that was quick resumable did quick resume after I unplugged the console while it was on, then plugged it back in, powered it back on, the game was exactly where I had left it off, and even games that I hadn't touched for days would quick resume after a full power down. So that was pretty impressive. Even physical edition of games like Resident Evil 7 quick resumed after a full power down. The disc was still in the console, and the game was installed on the console itself on the SSD after I initially inserted the disc, and that's why you can take advantage of quick resume on physical edition of games as well. But it was still nice to see that there was no issue there because of the disc being involved. The one caveat is that if you fully power down the console, the game that is active will not quick resume. So say you're in the middle of gameplay and the power goes out, the game that you are playing right there and then, that will restart completely, but any games that you suspended will continue to quick resume. So I tested this by unplugging the console while I was running a game, and also while I was playing the game and after I had gone to the home screen, I was wondering if that would pause the game, but it was still considered active even after I'd gone to the home menu. So when I powered off the console and turned it back on, when I unplugged it and plugged it back in, that active game was the only one that would not quick resume. All the other ones would. Which is why I would not rely on quick resume as an alternative for save files. If you haven't been saving your game and that game is active and the console is powered down, you will lose all that progress. And if that game happens to get too far back in the line of games that you've been running, it may restart and you might lose that progress. So yeah, don't become over-reliant on quick resume, but it is still a very neat feature that works as intended and that can work to a certain extent even after the console is fully unplugged. And in case this wasn't clear, this is only when I unplug the console, not when you turn it off in the menu and the console goes on standby. If you turn the console on while it's on standby, then whatever game was active will resume alongside quick resumable games. Next up, let's talk about backwards compatibility. So most games on Game Pass right now are backwards compatible, and the Xbox team did send me an Excel sheet giving me a full list of existing backwards compatible titles, and that list was pretty damn extensive. Though there were a couple of major omissions like Witcher 3, Gears 5, and now Hellblade. And I actually reached out to an Xbox representative about this, asking how many of these older games will be compatible for Series X, and why is it that certain games like Hellblade had compatibility initially, but after a system update, that compatibility got removed? The response I got reads as follows. Regarding your questions on backwards compatibility, the team plans to support thousands of back-compatible games available today on Xbox One, excluding Kinect-only games at launch. As far as those being pulled from previews, we may temporarily remove a game from the available backwards compatible library for preview participants in order to investigate reports of bugs, but we will aim to restore to the library as soon as we can. Please check back soon. So that's kind of what I figured. There might have been some kind of major bug when running Hellblade on Series X that they discovered during the preview process, so they pulled compatibility until they could fix that. That's fine by me, but that list of backwards compatible games is constantly being updated throughout the preview process, and I was told that by launch, thousands of these games will be compatible, and I'm sure that the compatibility list will continue to grow even after launch. And then for games like Witcher 3, we know that CD Projekt Red is working on a Witcher 3 next-gen upgrade that will be free to existing owners of the game, so that's why I figure Witcher 3 isn't compatible with next gen yet, because they're working on a version that will be enhanced for Series X and PS5. So what I'm trying to say is that this preview phase may not be fully representative of the full list of backwards compatible games and upgraded games from older gens being accessible and compatible with Series X. Let's now talk about performance. I obviously don't have some of the tools that, say, Digital Foundry does, so I can't give you exact stats, but I can tell you that I did notice a significant improvement in performance for certain titles. So Monster Hunter World in graphics mode seemed to run at a consistent, smooth 60 frames per second on the Series X, whereas on the One X, I could feel, as I was panning the camera around, I could feel the frame rate dipping and it kind of struggling a little bit, it being more inconsistent. And I've actually got footage to prove it, though I don't know how well this will come across on YouTube. But as I'm panning the camera around here on the Series X, frame rate was just smooth and consistent. On the One X, I can see the frame rate dipping, I can feel it, I can see stutters here and there as I'm rotating the camera. If you want to see hard numbers, hard results, I would recommend checking out Digital Foundry's results. And in fact, Digital Foundry did test Monster Hunter in resolution mode, and on the One X they saw dips that could go down into the 30s, whereas on the Series X you could see 60 frames per second with some dips here and there, but the game generally just feels a lot smoother on the Series X. In this Eurogamer article, you can see some of the results that they found for a variety of titles. So Dead or Alive 6 in 4K mode on the Xbox One X ran at roughly 30 frames per second. On the Series X, it runs smooth at 60 frames per second. Next up, we have Rise of the Tomb Raider. On the One X, frame rates could dip into the 40s. On the Series X, a consistent 60. Then we have Final Fantasy 15. That is a game that I got to test out on both Series X and One X, and I definitely noticed the performance improvement there. And it would seem as though Digital Foundry found similar results with smooth 60 frames per second on the Series X and frame rates dipping to, the 30s on the One X. Sekiro is one of those games that greatly benefits from having a smooth 60 frames per second. On the One X, it ran at 34 frames per second per Digital Foundry's test, whereas on the Series X, you got very close to 60 frames per second, with frame rates occasionally dipping here and there, but maintaining 58 frames per second around that region. Finally, this screenshot shows Grand Theft Auto 4 running on Series X, Xbox One X, and 360. As you can see, 60 frames versus 33 versus 36. Across the board, enhancements in performance are commonplace, and I'll emphasize again, not even optimized. These games have not been touched to be compatible for Series X. It just runs this way because of the improved hardware and because of good backwards compatibility implementation. Once these games are fully optimized for Series X, I can only imagine performance will be even better, loading times will be even better, games will just run buttery smooth and buttery swift. Alright, so with loading times, quick resume, and performance out of the way, let's actually talk about the console proper and the controller that it ships with. So you've seen the design, it's pretty minimalistic, somewhat monolithic looking, and it really in the living room doesn't stand out too much. It fits well in my entertainment center on a shelf. It is still significantly smaller than a gaming PC. For the amount of power that this console offers, it is a relatively small package, honestly. It's pretty compact. Moving to the front of the console, you'll find a disk drive, an eject button, a USB-A port, a Bluetooth sync button, and of course the Xbox logo that doubles as a power button. On the back, you've got two USB-A ports, a LAN cable port, an SSD memory card slot, the HDMI port, and the power port. There's nothing much going on the left side except for an Xbox logo that's kind of been engraved there. On the right side, you've got rubber feet that will allow the console to be placed horizontally very easily. On the top, you've got this pretty significant grille that allows for airflow, and beyond that, there's this cool little optical illusion that as you get closer to the top of the Series X, you'll see the green paint kind of become more visible, and it creates this illusion that there's a green glow that's expanding, which is just a cool little design element. Speaking of cooling, there's apparently some rumors out there that the Series X is prone to overheating. I have not found this to be the case at all. The console generally runs cool, games run smooth, and fans run pretty quietly. I can hear the fan running if I really get up close to it, but in the average distance that people sit away from their console looking at their TV, you're really not going to hear the console all that much, if at all. It's a very quiet console, and the cooling solution seems to be doing just fine. I have had zero issues on that front. At the bottom, you've got the circular stand that allows the console to be placed vertically, and this is not detachable from what I can tell, and beyond that, you've got more grills at the bottom here that will allow for even more airflow, especially if you set the console horizontally. Now, from what I've seen, most people place the console vertically. I've actually been using it horizontally because it kind of gets in the way of my short throw projector if I place it vertically, and that's worked out really nicely, and it looks pretty nice horizontally too. Again, just very minimalistic. It kind of blends into the background, very simple design. The side with the stand is exposed when you place it horizontally, and that does look a little strange, but it's really not that big of a deal. Dimensions-wise, compared to the One X, the Series X is about as tall as the One X, 11.85 inches versus 11.81 inches. It is, however, significantly wider than the One X, 5.94 inches for the Series X versus 2.36 inches on the One X. But Series X makes up for that by being significantly less deep. So Series X is 5.94 inches deep, whereas the One X is 9.45 inches deep. So if you place both consoles horizontally, the Series X actually takes up less surface area than the One X, though vertically it's a different story. And then in terms of weight, I found that both consoles weighed about the same. Official specs say that the Series X weighs 9.8 pounds and the One X weighs 8.4 pounds. I really couldn't tell that much of a difference. The Series X is a little heavier officially, but weight is evenly distributed, so lifting both consoles, they felt about the same. Still like substantial in their weight, but certainly nothing that anyone can't handle. The only major difference is because of the Series X's boxier shape, you do have to lift it with both hands for safety. With the One X, because it's thinner, you can kind of go like this, you can hold it like that. With the Series X, you really have to kind of hold it in a more secure way to make sure you don't drop it. But generally, neither console is all that difficult to carry around. The Series X I've had to handle more with two hands than with the One X, but that's about the only major difference. Last but not least, let's talk about the Series X's controller. So I've got the Series X and the One X controller right here, and at a glance, they're kind of hard to tell apart. You can see that they look very similar, and in fact, things like the analog stick and the face buttons feel exactly the same. But as you look closer, you can see some differences. The Series X has that third button in the center there. That's the share button that is not featured in the One X controller. The D-pad does look different on the Series X. But in terms of how these controllers feel, I would say the D-pad is the most substantial difference. Whereas on the One X, the D-pad can feel a bit wobbly. On the Series X, everything just feels stiffer. Right there. It's got a design reminiscent of the 360 controller, which you can see has that circular D-pad. This kind of harkens back to that a little bit, but whereas the 360 D-pad is utter shite, this D-pad right here, it feels much more tactile. Every direction feels like it presses and stays there instead of wobbling around. And because of the design here, where, I don't know if you can see this, but every direction of the D-pad kind of protrudes upwards like that. There's a square centerpiece, and every direction has an upward slant like that. And that makes every direction easier to feel out with your finger. There's kind of this sharp edge at the end of every side of the D-pad that will kind of sink into your thumb just ever so slightly, and it really lets you know exactly which direction you're pressing. And it also makes it less slippery because there is that upward slant in every direction. It's very hard for your finger to slip because that upward slant kind of keeps your thumb in place even if you're pushing really hard. Whereas on the One X, the D-pad is this slippery material. It's this kind of shiny looking plastic, and it's kind of all flat, so it is possible for your finger to kind of slip a little more than it is on the Series X. Now, the one drawback I'd say the Series X has over previous iterations is that the D-pad is louder. So on the One X, that's what that sounds like, and this is the Series X. It may sound like I'm nitpicking, but when you're playing a game where you're constantly using the D-pad, hearing this versus this makes a bit of a difference. You kind of notice the high-pitched clicking sound on the Series X more than the more subdued sound on the One X D-pad. It is something that I eventually got used to, but something worth noting. It is the loudest D-pad I've ever used. And it's just something that annoyed me a little bit starting out, but eventually I got used to it, and that noise kind of blended into the background. But I do hope that if they find ways to enhance this controller, they'll find a way to keep the exact feel here, but add something there that will make it a little more quiet to press the D-pad buttons, just so that it isn't quite as sharp and prominent while I'm playing a game. The shoulder buttons. On the One X, it sometimes can feel a little bit too easy to press the shoulder buttons to the point where I've had a couple times where I pressed them by accident. So it's a lot easier, a lighter touch to press that button. On the Series X, you really have to be much more deliberate about pressing the shoulder buttons before it actually presses. It's just a little stiffer, it feels a little better, and less prone to accidental presses. So I'm barely putting any force right here, whereas with this, I kind of have to go for it a little more. It's a subtle difference, but it makes a difference. Up top, you'll notice that the One X has a micro USB port, whereas the Series X has upgraded to USB-C. And you will also notice a difference in materials. On the One X, you can see this more slippery plastic material. On the Series X, it's more of a matte finish. And something that you can't see right here is that, or maybe you can, I don't know if the light will show this, but there is a texture to the triggers that makes it grippier. And because it isn't that shiny, slippery material, the buttons across the board feel less slippery. Like, as I press down these two, I can feel my finger here slipping a little bit, kind of moving around and slipping around. With this, though, my finger feels locked in place to that trigger button. Now, I do want to emphasize that these differences are subtle. It's not like this, if you have the One X controller, you should throw it away and it's useless. No, this is going to do you just fine. And they feel close enough where most people are probably not going to notice a huge difference, but the minor kind of adjustments that they made, they're welcome additions, and all of these small little enhancements do add up to a controller that ultimately does feel better. Oh, and one more thing that the Series X controller has is this texture that goes all the way around the back half of each grip. And so that makes it, well, grippier, whereas the One X controller doesn't have that texture, so it can feel a little slippery back there, especially when your hands maybe get a little sweaty as you're really intensely playing a game. But then again, this is the Cyberpunk 2077 Xbox One controller, and this actually does have a texture on the back side of the grip right here, not around here, but back here there is a grip, and I don't know if that's just a Cyberpunk controller thing or if the Xbox One controller was upgraded to have this universally. If you know, let me know in the comments below. But the Series X is just going to have that texture all the way around here universally. Just makes it easier to handle in subtle but significant ways. So that's all I'm allowed to talk about right now at this juncture, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to close by saying that I'm overall very impressed with the capabilities of the Series X, especially given that all of these games that run better, load better, perform better, they're not even optimized for Series X. They did a really good job with that compatibility, and it makes the Series X feel like a continuation. From the outset, you're going to have a back catalog of games, and you're going to have games that maybe you haven't played before that you'll find on Game Pass that will now run better, load better. Or maybe there are games that you've already played that you might want to revisit because they suddenly run way better on the Series X. At this point, the only reason to keep your One X or your One S is in case there are some games that may not be compatible with Series X at launch. But I really get the feeling that that's ultimately not going to be a huge problem. I get the sense that just about every game that needs to be compatible from the One to the Series will have that compatibility, and a lot of these games will receive upgraded versions for free for the Series X. And one last thing I'll say is kudos to Microsoft for sending preview units out so early. And I'm not just saying this because I got one. Even before I got mine, I was seeing outlets sharing their impressions of units that they had received. And that allows for early coverage that will keep customers informed about this investment that they're about to make. And this really speaks to Microsoft's confidence in their own product. And based on my impressions so far, everything generally works as intended. Overall, I feel like Microsoft nailed the hardware here. The only thing that's up in the air right now is what are the launch titles and what does the schedule of game releases look like for Xbox and Game Pass in the coming months and years. If they can release a constant and consistent stream of high-quality first-party titles, then they're going to be set. With that, I'd like to conclude my first impressions of the Xbox Series X. I hope this video was informative, and as we await the launch of the console, let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on the Series X based on everything you heard in this video. And let me know if you are planning to get one, if you're excited to get one. Drop a comment, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.